Former White House advisor Steve Bannon is waging what he calls, quote, a season of war against the GOP. That was at California during a GOP state convention. He called out former President George Bush, who he criticized, but of course didn't name President Trump in a recent speech. We heard the White House respond earlier as well.
President Bush, to me, embarrassed himself. Speechwriter wrote a highfalutin speech. It's clear he didn't understand anything he was talking about. He equates the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, globalization. He has no earthly idea whether he's coming or going. Just like it was when he was President of the United States. I want to apologize up front to any of the Bush folks outside in this audience, okay? Because there has not been a more destructive presidency than George Bush's.
Well, he said he would wage a war, and he is. Joining me now, Blake Rutherford of Cozen O'Connor Public Strategies and Elizabeth Harrington with the Washington Free Beacon. Thank you both for joining me today. I want to start with you, Elizabeth. Were you surprised when you heard this?
No, not really. I think Steve Bannon is doing exactly what he said he was going to do once he left the White House, which was, wage war with the Republican establishment. And I think this speech that the former President Bush gave is so instructive on this disconnect that there is between these kind of Republican establishment and Republican elites and their base of their party and their own voters. And I think what we saw in the primary and Trump winning, he really brought this to a head. And he's talking about issues and trying to work on issues that are actually important to the Republican base, like securing the border and fighting for American workers who've been left behind in this economy. And when President Bush gets up there and he says all of these things that sound nice, but it's really empty rhetoric when he says the biggest problem America is facing is a deficit of confidence. Well, what does that really mean? Because actually, consumer confidence is the highest it's been since before President Bush took office. All
right, Blake, I want to bring you in. There's a couple things that Elizabeth said, just a couple that I think you may disagree with. She had said that President Bush had seemed to have a disconnect. And she also had mentioned a little bit about the GOP base, what they find important. I want to ask you your opinion of these comments and if you find it constructive.
Well, I actually thought President Bush gave a tremendous speech. I think he's speaking to the state of the country in the time of President Trump and Steve Bannon, who are inextricably linked here. I think that his speech resonates on a global scale. I think it resonates with Democrats and independents. It doesn't resonate with, and it's not even the GOP base. It's the Steve Bannon, Donald Trump voter. And that's why Steve Bannon's waging war on the GOP and what he claims to be the GOP establishment, because there is this sector of voter who relates to him, who relates to the president, despite all of the nonsensical tweeting, despite the fact that there's a stalled legislative agenda, and despite the fact that the president really has been hardly constructive in the time that he's been in the White House.
Okay,
We've seen chaos upon chaos.
I want to expand on one of the points, because you talked about the division within voters. But I'm curious, as we move forward, Elizabeth, when we see these different speeches, these leaders at odds, what type of ripple effect is that going to have when we talk about members of Congress? Because it's going to get their base fired up. It's going to get constituents fired up. It could easily sway the decision of lawmakers, and we could see no tax reform, no health care, nothing on the budget. But we need that stuff to get done.
Right. And look, I think President Bush's speech only really played well with the media bubble and elites in both parties. And it doesn't play well to what the voters actually elected Donald Trump to do, which he talked about immigration. That has been the core issue of President Trump's campaign since he entered the race. And the fact of the matter is, President Bush may not remember his failed amnesty push in 2006, but the American people, and especially the Republican base, don't want that. They don't want it. They want to secure the border. They want the wall. That's been Trump's signature issue. And look, I think you're right. I think there is this disconnect, and I think it is kind of healthy for the party because you have figures like Bannon who are trying to hold Republicans accountable to what the promises they made. And McConnell, is on board, he says, with those agenda items like tax reform and health care that they agree on. It's just a matter if they can get it done.
All right, Blake, I want you to respond to that.
Yeah, well, look, I think that a couple of things are important here. President Bush is speaking as an ex-president, and I think you have a very different perspective and a very different role between being a president and ex-president. So I don't.
What about his
I don't
timing,
think it's particularly
Blake? What do you think?
helpful
Because he hasn't been vocal. So what about his timing? Why now?
Well, I mean, I think he certainly is. And again, I don't want to speak to his state of mind, but let's accept the fact that he certainly has been monitoring what's been going on in the United States. He's paid attention to the president's rhetoric. He's paid attention to this nationalist/white nationalist movement that Steve Bannon and Breitbart are leading, and I think he felt the opportunity was time for him to say something. I think it was supposed to be a bigger speech. It's generally not the role of an ex-president to wade into very specific policy fights. We'll see if that stays the same. So I disagree that this was a speech that was only meant to be for elites. I think that's become a common talk phrase among Bannon et al., and I think they're wrong.
All right. Well, Blake and Elizabeth, that's all we have time for today, but it's interesting. It's interesting to hear voices that we haven't heard before. Thank you both for joining us. The conversation continues. Appreciate it.
Well, almost immediately after allegations of abuse broke in the New York Times, Harvey Weinstein retreated into that favorite cocoon of the embattled celebrity, a luxury rehab clinic where he said he would battle against the disease of sex addiction. Doesn't seem to be going all that well from a treatment perspective. New reports say that Weinstein has been arriving late for therapy, falling asleep in sessions, even talking on a smuggled cell phone. Apparently, this disease is even worse than we could have imagined. Nell Daly is a psychotherapist. She's our window into this world, and she joins us now. So, Nell, there is new, just arriving on my iPhone, a new report that Harvey Weinstein is leaving the Arizona treatment program on Saturday, tomorrow, after a one-week treatment. His psychologist, says that he, and I'm quoting now, Harvey has been dealing with his anger, his attitude toward others, boundary work, and the beginnings of work on empathy. He's invested in the program. Pardon me if I call BS on that. Am I too cynical?
No, I would agree with you on that. I think 1 week is definitely not enough treatment time for someone who has been accused of what Harvey Weinstein's been accused of.
So it sounds like this whole thing was a deeply cynical PR diversion.
I mean, it could have been, right? We don't know. We don't know what his intentions were for actually going to treatment. I don't think he had very many options in terms of his PR. A lot of people who are wealthy and powerful will do something like this in order to avoid both legal action and try to rebuild their reputation. So I'm not surprised he went into
What bothers me, though, is that a licensed therapist would lend his name to a statement that non-credible, that after a week, a guy who's been apparently chatting on a cell phone and falling asleep in group meetings is on his way to a cure. As someone who practices psychotherapy, you can confirm that's ridiculous, correct?
I would say that, yes.
You would say
I would go out on a limb and say that, yes.
Go out on a limb and say that.
So
doesn't it discredit the whole enterprise, the institution of psychotherapy, these treatment centers? I mean, some of us are already suspicious about this business, but this makes it seem like a joke.
Well, the problem is that people who are accused, as he has been, of committing sexual crimes, what do we do with them in our society? So one of the things that we have to worry about is that they're going to commit these crimes again. So the reason for treatment programs is to hope that we can effect some sort of change so that when they come out of the treatment program, they're not a threat to the community.
So, I mean, there are, of course, as with everything, many different levels.
Totally.
So there are people who are considered, abusive, but the root is their boorishness and their self-involvement.
Right, and
being drunk.
Right, and there's a big difference between someone who has sexual addiction issues and someone who's actually a sexual offender.
But if you're exposing yourself to strangers in restaurants, that does seem to cross a line into, like, compulsion.
Well, compulsion and criminal activity.
Well, of course.
So I think that in this case in particular, what many people in the psychological community, many feminists want to see happen is he actually get prosecuted. And then if he is found guilty, and I know that the state of New York, Los Angeles, the police in Los Angeles, the police in London have opened up an investigation on him and even accusing him. There's been accusations that he's actually raped, some of these victims. Right. The hope is that he will get prosecuted, and if he's found guilty, go to jail. And then the question is, do we use taxpayers' money to have him get treatment in the prison system?
Does it ever work?
It's case-by-case basis.
But my impression of the recidivism rate for sex offenders is extraordinarily high.
Very high, very high. But the problem is that we can't lock people like this up in jail for life, if we can lock them up at all. So then what do you do? you have to give them some sort of
Well, don't you age out of it? I mean, he's 65 years old. Isn't there a point in a man's life when he's just too tired to sexually harass? No, I'm serious.
Yeah, I understand your question. The thing is that we can't come up with a sex offender profile. That's the one thing that we're having a hard time doing in the psychological community, because people who commit these crimes defy everything that we understand. It doesn't matter what age, what socioeconomic class. We can't quite pin down why people do this. The only thing that we do know is that the people who do commit sex crimes, 95% of them are men. So the question for me becomes, if 1 out of every 6 women in her lifetime is going to be a victim of sexual assault or rape, and 95% of the people who are the criminal offenders are men, how many men are getting away with this kind of behavior that we're not talking about? And as a society, are we complicit by not having some sort of larger understanding or system in place to actually prosecute people who do this?
Let's start with Hollywood and see where it goes from there. Really quickly, as a psychotherapist,
yes.
Don't you want to see some action taken against the ersatz shrink who's declaring Harvey Weinstein on the road to recovery? I mean, if I sell breakfast cereal and my rival breakfast cereal is like 30% rat hair, I want to take it off the market because it discredits breakfast cereal as a brand. Like, you know, it discredits all breakfast cereal. You don't feel that way as a shrink?
I'd have to yes, I would definitely question the judgment of that psychiatrist who is saying that he's on the road to recovery. But the problem is that he was in a voluntary
right.
treatment center. He wasn't a mandated criminal in a treatment facility.
But
so he's free to leave. He's free to leave when he wants to leave. As a psychiatrist, would I have personally come out? Again, I'm not involved in this case.
Yeah.
Would I personally come out after a week and say that, you know, I think that he's on the road to recovery? I wouldn't put my reputation
One thing that Harvey
like
Weinstein
that.
proves from top to bottom is you can hire people to defend you, whether it's Lisa Bloom using her fake feminist credentials or this shrink or whatever. It's very distressing. No, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on. Thanks.